Athens, 404 BC. The city is broken. Its empire has crumbled under Sparta's heel, its golden age flickering out like the last oil in a dying lamp. In the taverns, men drown their pride in wine and whisper of heroes long gone, of Pericles, of Socrates, of wisdom lost. And then, in one of those dim, smoky rooms, where the philosophers never dared to tread, a man rose from the dirt floor and shouted, "You call that wisdom? You pay coin to listen to men who argue for bread." The crowd laughed, but not all in jest. The man was filthy, his beard unkempt, his cloak torn, his eyes bright with both madness and genius. His name was Diogenes of Sinope, a wanderer, beggar, and self-proclaimed citizen of the world. And though Athens saw him as a lunatic, he would soon challenge its greatest mind, Socrates himself, and win in a way no one expected. They called Diogenes the dog philosopher. He slept in an old ceramic jar, ate scraps from the market, and mocked anyone who called themselves civilized. When people asked why he lived like an animal, he grinned and said, "Because dogs are honest. Men lie, cheat, and decorate their lies with philosophy." He despised hypocrisy more than poverty. In a world obsessed with pride and reputation, he saw truth hiding only in shame. To him, the man who needed nothing was freer than kings. But the Athenians couldn't ignore him. He would interrupt speeches, ridicule orators, and expose moralists as fools. It was as if he existed to insult the age itself, to strip Athens of its illusions. When Socrates walked through the agora, surrounded by students and admirers, they often crossed paths. To the Athenians, it was a meeting of opposites, wisdom and madness, reason and chaos, wine and water. Yet both men claimed to seek the same thing, truth. According to legend, the encounter that made Diogenes infamous began one summer afternoon in the marketplace. Socrates was surrounded by followers, discussing the nature of virtue. He argued that true wisdom came from knowing one's own ignorance, a statement that made the crowd nod in reverence. Diogenes, sitting nearby and gnawing on a piece of bread, burst out laughing. Socrates paused. "Do you mock wisdom, stranger?" he asked calmly. Diogenes stood, crumbs falling from his beard. "No, I mock your wisdom," he said. "You talk of ignorance as if it's gold, and then sell it to fools for praise." The crowd gasped. Even Socrates' students fell silent. No one insulted the master that way, not in public, not without fear. Socrates smiled. "Then tell me," he said, "what is wisdom, if not the knowledge of our ignorance?" Diogenes tilted his head, the faint smell of wine rising from him like defiance. "Wisdom," he said, "is not knowing you are ignorant. It's not caring that you are. For a wise man lives as he pleases, not as others expect." It was an answer so simple, so brutally free of logic, that it left the philosopher speechless. For once, Socrates had met someone he could not corner with questions, because Diogenes refused to play by reason's rules. Later, the story spread through Athens like wildfire. The drunken beggar who had defeated Socrates without argument. Some laughed, some were outraged, but others, especially the young, were fascinated. They began to follow Diogenes through the streets, watching him live his strange philosophy. He begged without shame, slept under the stars, and mocked anyone who pitied him. When a rich man offered him food, he spat it out and said, "You feed me as you feed your dog, but you will never eat as freely as he does." When another asked him how to become virtuous, Diogenes simply said, "Throw away your pride. Then you'll see what's left." He turned every moral into mockery, every virtue into a joke, and in doing so, revealed how hollow the city's ideals had become. The philosophers called him insane. The priests called him impious. But Diogenes didn't care. He claimed to serve no god, no city, no desire except truth itself. He said, "Other men write laws. I break them and call it honesty." That honesty, raw, embarrassing, and fearless, would soon draw more than just ridicule. It would draw the attention of Plato, Socrates' greatest student, who saw in Diogenes not madness, but danger. Because if Socrates had taught Athens to question, Diogenes taught it to laugh, and laughter, in a city of pride, was the most dangerous weapon of all. The year was 399 BCE, and Athens had become a city of contradictions. Its walls still bore the scars of war. Its people still carried the weight of empire lost. Yet in the agora, the heart of the city, philosophers preached about virtue, justice, and the soul, while beggars starved in the same streets. No one saw this hypocrisy more clearly than Diogenes of Sinope, the man they called the dog. He earned that name not out of insult, but out of choice. I fawn on those who give, bark at those who don't, and bite scoundrels, he once said, just like any honest dog should. He lived not in a home, but in a pithos, a giant clay jar near the temple of Cybele. He owned nothing but a cloak, a stick, and a small bowl. That bowl he eventually threw away when he saw a child drinking water from his hands. A child, he laughed, has outdone me in simplicity. Every act of his life was an insult to convention, and that made him more dangerous than an army. While Socrates sought wisdom through reason, and Plato dreamed of ideal forms, Diogenes waged war on illusion itself. He mocked money, mocked politics, mocked religion, and most of all, he mocked the polite lies men told to survive. Once, when Plato lectured on the definition of man as a featherless biped, Diogenes appeared the next day in the academy, holding up a plucked chicken. "Behold," he shouted, "Plato's man." The students erupted in laughter. Plato, humiliated, revised his definition to include "with broad nails." And from that day, their rivalry burned like hidden fire beneath Athens' polite smiles. Diogenes was not just mocking Plato. He was mocking the very foundation of philosophical arrogance. To him, men like Plato and Socrates lived in words. Diogenes lived in truth. When Plato called him Socrates gone mad, Diogenes replied, "If I am mad, it's only because I refuse to be deceived." But behind his ridicule was a deep, terrifying idea. Diogenes believed that civilization itself was a trap, a gilded cage for men who feared their own freedom. He preached a philosophy later called cynicism, from the Greek kynikos, dog-like. Its core was brutal simplicity, to live in accordance with nature, without lies, possessions, or shame. He rejected laws, currency, marriage, even the concept of home. He said, "I am a citizen of the world." To Athenians, who defined virtue by city, class, and gods, those words were heresy. He performed natural acts, eating, sleeping, even relieving himself, in public, to show that nature is honest and only men are ashamed of it. Animals, he said, live by nature and are blameless. Men hide what animals do openly and call it morality. One afternoon, a group of students found him sleeping in the sun. They mocked him, asking, "If you're so wise, why live like a dog?" Without opening his eyes, Diogenes replied, "Because dogs don't build temples to bones and call it virtue." But he wasn't just insulting people. He was dissecting Athens' soul, showing that even its greatest minds worshipped comfort disguised as wisdom. And yet, paradoxically, his madness drew admirers. The poor saw in him a hero who feared nothing, the young, a rebel unchained by hypocrisy. Even the rich came to gawk, tossing him coins as if he were an exotic beast. He would pick up a coin, examine it, and fling it away. "Your silver smells of sweat and slavery," he'd say. "Keep it." Soon, word reached Plato that Diogenes was calling him a salesman of shadows. Plato invited him to a private debate, part curiosity, part defense of honor. In that quiet chamber lined with scrolls, Athens' two most brilliant minds faced each other. Plato began, calm and articulate. "Virtue, my friend, is harmony, the soul governing the body through reason." Diogenes burst out laughing. "Harmony? Then you must be a broken liar, Plato, for I've never heard a philosopher make so much noise while saying nothing." Plato frowned. "You speak like a drunk, not a sage." Diogenes leaned closer, his eyes sharp with mischief. "Perhaps, but at least I'm drunk on life, not ideas." Silence fell. Even Plato, master of reason, had no reply. And from that day forward, The rumor spread through Athens that the dog had outsmarted the master. Not with logic, but with the truth logic was too proud to admit, that men often mistake talking about virtue for living it. When Socrates heard of the encounter, he smiled faintly and said, "The man mocks wisdom, but he may be wiser than he knows." But Diogenes didn't seek Socrates' approval or anyone's. He lived as he pleased, free from need, free from fear. And yet, the city that tolerated philosophers began to grow uneasy with him, for his laughter was no longer harmless. It was rebellion. Soon, his mockery would draw not just ridicule, but power. Because one day, a conqueror would march into Athens and demand to meet the madman who feared no king. And Diogenes would teach Alexander the Great a lesson no sword could erase. It was a bright morning in Corinth, around 336 BCE, when the world's most powerful man came searching for the world's poorest. The young Alexander of Macedon, already master of Greece and dreaming of Asia, had heard tales of a strange philosopher who lived in a barrel, mocked kings, and claimed to own nothing but freedom. "Find me this Diogenes," he commanded his guards. "I wish to see what kind of man dares to live without fear." The soldiers scoured the city until they came to a small hillside near the marketplace, where a man lay half-naked in the sun, asleep beside a broken jug. Flies buzzed around him. His cloak was little more than rags. Yet there was something unsettling in his stillness, like a lion sleeping with its eyes half open. When they roused him, he squinted up at the sun and muttered, "Tell your master I am busy basking in the warmth of the only king I know." The soldiers hesitated, but Alexander laughed. "Leave him be," he said. "I will go to him." The crowd gathered quickly, merchants, philosophers, beggars, and nobles alike. They whispered in disbelief as the conqueror, son of Philip II, pupil of Aristotle, and heir to all of Greece, approached the beggar known as the dog. Alexander stood tall in his bronze armor, his shadow falling across Diogenes' face. "I am Alexander," he said. "I have heard of your wisdom. Is there anything I can do for you?" Diogenes sat up slowly, blinked at the general, and replied, "Yes. Stand out of my sunlight." The crowd gasped. Even Alexander's guards gripped their spears, expecting insult or execution. But the young king only stared at him, and then he laughed. A deep, honest laugh that cut through the silence. "If I were not Alexander," he said, "I would wish to be Diogenes." And Diogenes, without missing a beat, murmured, "If I were not Diogenes, I would wish to be Diogenes." It was a moment that froze in history, a collision between absolute power and absolute freedom. One ruled the world, the other ruled himself. That encounter became legend. But few knew what happened afterward, when the crowd dispersed and the sun began to set over Corinth. Alexander lingered for a moment, studying the man who had dared to humiliate him with simplicity. "Do you not fear me?" he asked softly. Diogenes looked at him, his eyes gleaming in the fading light. "I fear only losing what you cannot give and cannot take away, my freedom." Alexander was silent. In that instant, he saw the truth. For all his armies, his titles, and his ambitions, he was chained to desire, while this filthy beggar was free. As the conqueror rode away, his generals mocked the encounter. But Alexander told them, "You laugh, because you do not see. That man lives as a god among men." Years later, Diogenes would retell the story to a group of young cynics sitting by the harbor. "Alexander wanted to rule the world," he said, "but I already ruled the one thing he couldn't, myself." He spat into the dirt and added, "The only empire worth conquering lies between your ribs." To his followers, Diogenes wasn't a philosopher. He was a mirror. He reflected the hypocrisy of the world and shattered it with laughter. He showed that a man could strip himself of everything, status, comfort, reputation, and still possess more truth than kings or scholars. But not everyone admired him. The rich hated his defiance. The priests called him blasphemous. And soon, Plato, now an aging master of the academy, began referring to him as the fool who mistook insolence for freedom. Diogenes replied by barging into Plato's lecture one afternoon, muddy and barefoot, while Plato was speaking of the ideal man. He walked across the polished floor, trampling the fine rugs, and spat. "I spit," he said, "on Plato's pride." The students gasped, but Plato only sighed. "And yet," he said, "Diogenes proves my point, that the world cannot exist without its madmen." Still, despite the mockery, something about Diogenes unnerved even the wisest. He wasn't like the others. He didn't just talk about detachment, he lived it. When thieves stole his few possessions, he shrugged. "They've freed me from carrying burdens," he said. When someone found him searching through the streets with a lantern in broad daylight and asked what he was doing, he replied, "I am looking for an honest man." And when they asked if he had found one, he smiled sadly. "Not yet." His words spread through Greece like sparks in dry grass. To the rich, he was a joke. To the poor, a saint. To history, he would become the philosopher who tore the mask off civilization itself. But even Diogenes could not escape time. As age crept upon him, he began to spend more hours by the harbor, staring at the horizon. His body grew frail, but his tongue stayed sharp. When asked how he wished to be buried, he laughed. "Throw me to the dogs. I owe them that much." Yet there was one thing he had not yet revealed, the final secret of his philosophy, whispered only to his closest students. It wasn't written on scrolls, nor taught in debates, but lived through a single act that would scandalize Athens forever. And that act began with a dead slave. It was a cold evening in Corinth, the sea wind sharp with salt and decay. By then, Diogenes was an old man, his skin leathery, his hair thin and white, yet his eyes still burned with the same wild fire. He had long since outlived Socrates, Plato, and even Alexander. Athens had rebuilt its pride, Corinth had grown rich, and philosophy had become a fashionable performance. But Diogenes? He remained the same, barefoot, hungry, and free. And then one morning, something happened that would make the city question whether the dog philosopher had finally gone mad, or had revealed the last, forbidden truth of his creed. A slave had died in the marketplace. No one knew his name. No one claimed his body. The merchants covered the corpse with a rag and went back to business, as if death itself were nothing but another inconvenience. That evening, Diogenes sat beside the body. People watched from a distance, whispering. He didn't pray. He didn't weep. He just stared at the corpse with a kind of reverence. Then, slowly, he began to strip it of its rags and wash the body in the public fountain. The crowd recoiled in disgust. "Dog," someone shouted. "You defile the dead." But Diogenes didn't look up. He said, "You build temples for gods who never lived, but you leave men to rot. Tell me, which is the greater sin?" He wrapped the body in his own cloak and carried it to a quiet field beyond the walls. When a young follower asked why, Diogenes said softly, "He was a slave in life. He shall be free in death." It was that night, under a waning moon, that Diogenes spoke his final lesson. He gathered his students, those few who had stayed through years of mockery, and lit a small fire. Then, pointing to the body laid before them, he said, "This man's chains are gone. His master's coins mean nothing. The worms will dine as kings tonight, and yet they will not argue over philosophy." The students were silent. One asked, "Master, do you believe the soul lives on after death?" Diogenes smiled faintly. "Does the flame live after the oil is gone?" he replied. "The soul is not a guest in the body. It is the body's hunger to live. When that hunger ends, all is peace." They pressed him further. "Then why speak of virtue or truth if nothing lasts?" He turned to the corpse, his face lit by firelight. "Because the lie lasts longer," he said, "and it takes courage to die honest." Those were words no philosopher dared to speak aloud. To deny the immortal soul was to challenge not only Plato's forms, but the gods themselves. And yet, for Diogenes, truth was not sacred, it was natural. "Nature," he said, "has no temples. Only fools build walls to trap eternity." By dawn, the story had spread. The dog had buried a slave as if he were a friend. Priests denounced him for impiety. Philosophers accused him of blasphemy. But when they confronted him, Diogenes only laughed. You worship the souls of heroes, he said, but you would not touch a dead man's hand. Tell me, who among us truly believes in the soul? To him, the human obsession with purity, virtue, and immortality was just fear of being nothing. He once told a curious youth, "You fear death because you've never lived without shame. Try it once. It's freedom." The cynic creed, the one Diogenes had lived his entire life, was now clear. Freedom was truth. Truth was nature. And nature feared nothing. Not death, not gods, not man. Weeks passed. Diogenes began to weaken. He still wandered the streets, still mocked the rich and lectured the young, but his steps grew slower, his voice softer. One day, as he sat in the sun surrounded by his students, a merchant offered him food. He refused. "I've eaten enough of life," he murmured. That evening, he lay down beside the same broken jar where he had once slept as a young man. The city was quiet. The marketplace had emptied. He gazed toward the horizon and whispered, "Even dogs must sleep." When the sun rose, Diogenes was gone. Some said he died of old age. Others claimed he held his breath and chose the hour himself. And a few whispered darker tales, that he simply stood up, walked into the sea, and let the tide take him. But the truth, as always with Diogenes, was less about what he did, and more about what he meant. After his death, the Corinthians built a statue of him holding a lantern. At its base were carved the words, "He searched for an honest man." Plato's students scorned the tribute. The priests refused to bless it. But the people, those who had once mocked him, left bread, wine, and flowers at its feet. Because in the end, even they understood, Diogenes had lived without fear, without pride, without lies. He had shown them what it meant to be free and what it cost. Yet his final words, those spoken to a single student in the last days of his life, would haunt the world for centuries. Words that revealed the real meaning behind his madness and why he had spent his life laughing at gods and kings alike. Those words would change philosophy forever. The young student's name was Crates of Thebes, a quiet, awkward man who had followed Diogenes for years, watching him ridicule the world with fearless joy. He had seen his master mocked, beaten, starved, and ignored. Yet he had also seen him smile when emperors frowned and laugh when philosophers raged. So when Diogenes lay dying beneath the morning sun, Crates knelt beside him and asked, "Master, tell me the truth. Why do you laugh when the world hates you?" Diogenes' lips curled into that familiar grin, the one that had terrified Athens and charmed kings. "Because," he whispered, "the world hates what it cannot own." Crates frowned. "And what is it that the world cannot own?" The old man opened his eyes one last time. "A free soul." Then, after a long pause, he added something that Crates would later call the forbidden secret of the cynic way. "A man is free when nothing can be taken from him. Not his gold, not his name, not even his truth. The gods may rule the heavens, but the man who needs nothing rules himself." Those words, simple yet blasphemous, would echo through time. Crates buried his master near the city walls, wrapped not in robes, but in his tattered cloak. He carved no name on the grave, just a single word, freedom. And from that nameless tomb, a movement was born. Students began to spread Diogenes' teachings across Greece, not as a school of logic, but as a rebellion of spirit. They wandered barefoot, owning nothing, laughing at the powerful. They were called cynics, not an insult, but in honor of their master, the dog. And though Athens forgot him for a time, history did not. Because centuries later, when empires rose and fell, when new gods replaced old ones, philosophers still repeated his truths, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in awe. Stoics like Zeno of Citium built their entire creed on Diogenes' example. Epictetus, himself a freed slave, would later say, "I am not Diogenes, but I am his disciple." Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king of Rome, wrote in his journals, "Let your mind be as Diogenes, unshaken by gold or empire." From the gutter of Athens, the beggar who owned nothing had shaped the conscience of kings. But what made Diogenes truly dangerous was not his words, it was his laughter. When he mocked Plato's ideals, he wasn't just ridiculing philosophy. He was revealing a truth too raw for his age, that man builds false gods from his own fears of poverty, shame, and death, and then calls them virtue. He tore those idols down with a grin. When I see men praying for wealth, he once said, I know they've already become slaves. He laughed at honor, mocked modesty, spat on glory, because he saw them as chains polished to look like crowns. To him, there was no higher truth than this, to live according to nature without lies. Everything else was theater. In that, he was both the drunk who mocked Socrates and the prophet who saw farther than Plato. Centuries later, when Roman scholars studied the fading scrolls of Greek wisdom, they wrote that Diogenes was mad, obscene, beyond decency. But even they admitted, no man had ever lived so close to truth. He was what humanity feared most, a mirror that laughed back. In a world obsessed with laws and appearances, Diogenes reminded mankind that honesty is the rarest luxury, and freedom the most forbidden philosophy of all. He proved that one could live without wealth, without comfort, without pride, and still possess everything that mattered. And so, while Plato's academy turned to dust and Socrates' dialogues faded into scrolls, Diogenes' laughter survived, in every thinker who dared to say, I need nothing. When storms swept the city that winter, Corinth's citizens found his jar cracked by rain. Inside, someone had placed a small lamp, the same kind he once carried through the streets, muttering, I am looking for an honest man. And though the lamp's flame had long burned out, the idea behind it never did. Today, when philosophers speak of cynicism, they remember his scorn. But what they forget is his compassion, the strange, wild empathy that came from stripping life bare. He laughed not to destroy mankind, but to free it. He mocked the world not because he hated it, but because he refused to worship its illusions. And maybe that's why, when Alexander heard of his death, he said softly, there was only one man in the world who could have taught me not to conquer it. For even the conqueror of nations knew what Diogenes had known all along, that the only kingdom worth ruling is the one within. And so, the drunk who mocked Socrates, the beggar who humiliated Plato, and the madman who defied Alexander, left behind a truth too simple and too terrifying for civilization to forget. To live free, you must first lose everything that owns you. And with that, the dog of Athens, mocked, filthy, divine, outlived them all.